Hello, and welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Kathleen Daggett with the Friends of History, and I'll be your host today. These monthly lectures are provided free of charge by the Friends of History of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. We do accept and encourage donations. Your contributions directly support the lecture series, and more importantly, the New Mexico History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to give a gift, any amount is appreciated. Please go to our website, click on the donate button at the top of the page. Our speaker today is David Beyreis, Chair of Humanities and Social Sciences at St. Mary's School in Raleigh, North Carolina, and author of Blood in the Borderlands, Conflict and Kinship and the Bent Family, 1821 to 1920. Dr. Beyreis will be speaking today about Blood in the Borderlands, focusing on the rise and fall of Charles Bent. At the time of his violent death in 1847, Charles Bent was one of the most powerful men in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. He first came to New Mexico in 1829 and rapidly became an economic power broker in the region. When the United States government made Bent governor of New Mexico in September of 1846, his possibilities seemed limitless, but he was killed only 4 months later. In addition to his book, Dr. Beyreis is the author of articles in Southwest Borderlands and Great Plains history. His work has received awards from the Historical Society of New Mexico, the Santa Fe Trails Association, Westerners International, and the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Oklahoma and currently teaches history at St. Mary's School. And now let's welcome David Beyreis.
Well, thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. I'd like to thank the Friends of History, and I'd also particularly like to thank Kathleen for reaching out for this opportunity and Grant for recording. What I'd like to talk to you tonight about is a topic that many people in New Mexico and Colorado, especially Western history aficionados, are probably pretty familiar with, the story of the Bent family. They've been very fortunate in their chroniclers. David Lavender's 1954 classic, Bent's Fort. Bernard DeVoto wrote about them pretty extensively in his book, 1846, The Year of Decision. And these books present the Bents as sort of the dominant figures in the Southwest Borderlands and Southern Plains, that they sort of dictated the terms of engagement and they dominated all their opponents. I'd like to argue it's a little bit different. The Bents, if they're successful, it's not because they do things on their own. It's because they're very well connected to family networks. So I want to talk a lot about family tonight, and especially about the role that family plays, not only in laying the groundwork for Bent's success, but I think ultimately for his failure as well. So tonight's, this afternoon's topic, Blood in the Borderlands, the Rise and Fall of Charles Bent, 1829 to 1847. So before we begin, I think it's important to understand a little bit about the Bent family and their background. I'm going to talk primarily about Charles Bent tonight, but I'm also going to bring in William Bent a little bit and their business partner, Saron Sanvra. The Bents are originally a family. Charles Bent is born in Virginia in the 1790s. The family moves to Missouri in the early 1800s. And very quickly becomes attached to some pretty powerful families in the St. Louis area. The Bents are not by any means elite, but they associate with and have connections to some of the powerful French Creole trading families in St. Louis, particularly the Choteau family and the Pratts. And I think very early on, Charles Bent understands the necessity of having very sort of powerful patrons and allies to advance his business interest. Charles Bent began his Western experience in the fur trade, like so many young men in St. Louis. He worked on the Missouri River in the 1820s for a man named Joshua Pilcher. He spent probably at least one season trapping in the Rocky Mountains and attended at least one rendezvous, probably in 1827 or 1828. But by 1829, he sort of figured that the chances for his success on the Missouri River were dwindling. And so he decides to do what so many other young men on the Missouri frontier are doing. He decides to go to Santa Fe. And so in 1829, along with his younger brother William, they travel west over the Santa Fe Trail. And this is Charles's first trip over the trail, but yet he's elected captain of his wagon train. And they spend a number of years in the late 1820s, early 1830s, bouncing back and forth between Missouri and Santa Fe. Sometime around 1830, Charles Bent and William Bent come into contact with Ceran Sandbras. Sandbras is from a French Creole family in Missouri. After his father died, he grew up in the household of Bernard Pratt, who was a very well-connected fur trader. And Sandbras had come to New Mexico a few years earlier than the Bents. He was engaged in, he was a trapper and also owned a store and sold supplies to trappers in the Southern Rockies. Probably in 1830, the Bent brothers form a partnership with Sandbras. There's no definitive date. I was unable to find any sort of a charter for the company, but I date their relationship and the beginnings of Bent, Sandbras and Company to about 1830. Over the next couple of years, the Bent brothers and Sandbras sort of began working out their business model. And this image here, you'll see the very superb National Park Service reconstruction of Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River, just outside of present-day La Junta, Colorado. And William Bent was basically in charge of the Indian trade on the Arkansas, and Bent's Fort's technical name was Fort William. So William Bent sort of oversees the Indian trade aspect of the business. Sandbras sort of holds down the New Mexico side. As we're going to see, Sandbras Roman Catholic, which helps. He's bilingual, and he spends a lot of time. The company eventually establishes stores in Taos and Santa Fe, and Sandbras spends a lot of time in northern New Mexico. Charles Bent is sort of a floater. He bounces back and forth. He spends a lot of time going back and forth over the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and New Mexico. He purchases goods. He draws up contracts with merchants and bankers. And so he moves around a lot. He becomes the partner's sort of, I guess you could call political fixer, which is going to get him in some trouble later on. So by the mid 1830s, they have a pretty well established business model. And certainly by the 1840s, they are very successful. By the time of the U.S. Mexico War, Bent, Sandbras and Company is the single most successful and profitable trading firm on the Southern Plains and northern New Mexico borderlands. So how do they become so successful? Well, they become so successful because of their family connections. And if you're familiar with the history of the fur trade, you know that intermarriage between traders, whether they're Anglo-American, French-Canadian, Russian even, intermarriage with native groups is absolutely essential to their success. For many native peoples, if you're not kin, you're a stranger. If you're a stranger, you're probably an enemy. So intermarriage with native peoples gains traders access to trade goods, in the Bent case, particularly bison robes. It also provides them with protection. It provides the men with sexual companionship. And for native peoples, it supplies preferential access to trade goods. The Bents later on will become very firm advocates for their Southern Cheyenne, in particular, family members. And William Bent marries 3 Southern Cheyenne sisters. He marries into the most prominent family in the Southern Cheyenne Nation. The same holds true for the Mexican borderlands. And we see this over and over and over again. We see it in Texas, we see it in New Mexico, we see it in California. Unattached Anglo-American men, French-Canadian men coming into Mexico, marrying, or in Bent's case, cohabiting with local Mexican women, establishing these political connections, establishing these economic connections. Intermarriage really works in the same way and for the same purposes. So what we're going to see is that Charles Bent is in this world of northern New Mexico, but he is not of this world. And what I mean by that is that a lot of American immigrants to the borderlands, if they sort of play by the rules, they become Mexican citizens, which means they have to become Roman Catholic. They become bilingual. They marry local women. And I stress marry in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And they use marriage and Catholicism and Mexican citizenship to gain access to land and opportunities. Bent is bilingual, but he never becomes Catholic. He never actually marries his wife. In effect, he really sort of tries to gain all the benefits that come with marriage and citizenship without taking on any of the obligations that come with it. So he's in a very interesting position. And there are a lot of people who take their religion seriously, who take citizenship seriously, who look at Bent and say, he's not really, he's not one of us. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Now, before we get into to Bent himself and his relationship, it's worth pointing out a couple things about the position of women in the Mexican borderlands. By comparison to women in the United States, women in New Mexico have a much wider range of political and economic opportunities and economic rights. Mexican law is based on Spanish law, which is based on Roman law. And under Spanish and Mexican law, women have the right to inherit, they have the right to own property, they have the right to dispose of property however they see fit, they have the right to draw up and execute wills, they can testify in court, they can sue in court. Women in the United States, if they're married, don't have any of these rights. And so Bent, he marries, as we're going to see, a woman marries, I put that in quotation marks, a woman named Maria Ignacia Jaramillo. And as we can see, that this image here is a land conveyance that Maria Ignacia Jaramillo was involved in. By all accounts, she was a very shrewd businesswoman. She owned property in Taos, and in the archives in Santa Fe, in the New Mexico State Records Collection, I found numerous land deeds and land transactions where Jaramillo sold land, bought land, sold houses, bought houses, and you can see here I've highlighted her name in this land conveyance. So she's a very formidable woman in her own right. So the image here, Charles and Maria Ignacia Jaramillo. Now, the Jaramillo family is pretty well positioned in northern New Mexico, in the Rio Arriba country. They're not by any means elite. There are wealthier families around Taos, and certainly their wealth and land holdings do not match the wealthier Rico class that you see down by Albuquerque. But they're very respectable, and they're really the Jaramillo family is really well connected to other more influential families. So we're going to talk a little bit more later on about the Vigil family. So Maria Ignacia Jaramillo's first husband had died before she met Charles Bent, and she's going to be related. We're going to talk about Cornelio Vigil, who was her uncle, and also Donaciano Vigil, who was a very, as you know, very famous New Mexican politician and military man. And Bent begins his relationship with Jaramillo sometime between about 1832 and 1835. And I say relationship, and I put marriage in quotation marks because I can't find any evidence that they were actually married. There's no evidence that Bent ever becomes Catholic. And the best evidence I can find that they're not married is in the parish baptismal records in Taos. All of Jaramillo's children are listed, and the couple has 4 children during the time of their relationship. 3 of the children survive. And in each case, the father is listed as unknown in the parish register. Everybody knows who the father is, but in the eyes of the church, the children are illegitimate because Bent never actually marries Jaramillo in the eyes of the church. This is not necessarily uncommon, but Bent's a pretty controversial character already, so he's not doing himself any favors with other members of the community by not marrying and not becoming a citizen. As you probably know, the other very famous union involving the Jaramillo family is Kit Carson and Maria Ignacia's younger sister, Josefa Jaramillo. So Kit Carson and Charles Bent are theoretically brothers-in-law. Other members of the Bent faction, I guess you could say, also established relationships with New Mexican women. His younger brother George cohabits with a New Mexican woman, has 2 children with her. Sandra cohabits over the years with 3 different women, having a child with each of them. Another of Bent's allies that we're going to talk about, Carlos Bobien, he does marry, he does become a citizen, and that's going to become really important down the line. Now, despite these relationships, by all accounts, Bent really doesn't seem to like his New Mexican neighbors. I get the sense that his relationship with New Mexicans is based on how useful they are to him. If he can get something out of them, he's willing to tolerate them. He's willing to coexist with them. If they oppose him, he can be absolutely vicious. There's a letter from 1845 that he writes to Manuel Alvarez, who was the U.S. consul in Santa Fe, and he says, I'll just quote a brief piece from it. He wrote that, quote, "The Mexican character is made up of stupidity, obstinacy, ignorance, duplicity, and vanity." And then he goes on and on and on and on. And this runs through years of his correspondence. So not a particularly likable fellow. Now, what also emerges, and even if he doesn't like many New Mexicans, he recognizes he has to deal with them. This is the price of doing business. And we're going to talk about 2 of his allies and rivals. On my left, you see the very famous Taos priest, Padre Antonio Jose Martinez, and the Martinez family in Taos sort of emerges as the most powerful counterweight to the Bent faction in that part of New Mexico. And then on the right, the gentleman in the jaunty hat, of course, is Manuel Armijo, several times governor of New Mexico, and we'll talk about him as well. Now, to understand one of the things that makes Bent's story so complicated, we need to understand very briefly a couple things about Mexican politics during this period. Mexico becomes independent from Spain in 1821, and then really for the next almost 50 years, the nation is very unstable. It's rocked by a series of revolutions, invasions, presidential administrations turn over with startling rapidity. And for Mexican citizens on the northern frontier, and what I mean is Texas, New Mexico, California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Coahuila, places like that, they really don't have a very good relationship with Mexico City. Many of the frontiersmen and the frontiersmen in New Mexico that sort of associate with Bent are what we call Federalists. Federalists believe in local control. They resent Mexico City. They sort of, New Mexicans consider themselves Nuevo Mexicanos first, Mexicans second. And the Federalists also sort of believe that the best interest of the local economy is oftentimes going to be served by closer ties with the United States and with U.S. merchants. This is not to say they're not patriotic Mexican citizens. They are. Their definition of patriotism is just a little bit different. Now, people who oppose Bent generally tend to fall into a group known as the Centralists. The Centralists believe that sort of authority emanates from Mexico City, that Mexico City issues directives, the frontier follows. The sort of pillars of centralist society are the large landholding elites, the military generals, the military leadership, and also the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. And Martinez and Armijo both, sometimes they're centralists, sometimes they're federalists. They sort of change back and forth as circumstances dictate. Now, in this context of struggle in Mexico and struggle in the northern borderlands, Bent finds himself in some pretty sticky situations. I'll give you just a couple of brief examples. 1837, the Chimayo Rebellion. Governor Albino Perez is sent north from Mexico City. New Mexicans don't like him. There are new taxes. There's a revolt. Perez is killed, he's decapitated. There's a rebel junta that governs New Mexico for a little while, and then eventually it falls apart. The supporters of the government, the supporters of Perez, blamed Americans in New Mexico, particularly Charles Bent, for seeding the rebellion. They actually believed that that Bent was working in cahoots with Texans, which is going to be a continuous theme. And there was one New Mexican clergyman who wrote in a letter, he basically said that Bent was the, quote, conduit between the rebels and the Texans. There's no evidence for this, but we're going to see that, as Bent's reputation suffers, he gets blamed for a lot of things, and he's guilty of a lot of stuff, but not this. 1841, 1843, as you probably know, there are Texan filibustering expeditions designed to, at the very least, seize control of the Santa Fe Trail. If the Texans are optimistic, they hope to annex Mexico. Both of these fail, but both times Bent is again associated with the Texans. His home is searched, his store is trashed by customs officials. He's on one point assaulted by a mob, spends some time under house arrest. So again, as we get into the 1840s, he's got a pretty lousy reputation. And there are some other sources of tension that go beyond Mexican politics, and this is where it gets even more complicated. This image here, this is from a Cheyenne artist, a man named, I believe, Lone Wolf. And this is an image of a meeting between Southern Cheyennes and the Kiowas and Comanches on the Arkansas River about 1840. The image is entitled Giving Gifts Across the River. The Kiowas and Comanches gave gifts of horses to the Cheyennes. The Cheyennes gave the Comanches food and clothing and possibly some guns. The importance of this is that it brings together two very powerful native confederacies in the region. And remember, William Bent has very deep kinship ties to the Southern Cheyenne. When the Comanches especially make peace with the Cheyenne, it frees them up to begin absolutely hammering Mexico's northern frontier with a series of very devastating raids in the early 1840s. The Kiowas raid into Mexico, the Comanches raid into Mexico, the Arapahoes and Cheyennes also from time to time raid into New Mexico. So the Bents have these family connections with these very powerful native peoples who are either causing problems for New Mexico or certainly causing problems in other parts of Mexico. And as this situation becomes clear, there are all sorts of accusations levied at the Bents. They're accused of gun running, selling guns to native peoples. I can't find any direct evidence of this. They're accused of selling liquor to native peoples. Again, no direct evidence, but I find a lot of circumstantial evidence. I can believe this one. I don't have any trouble believing it. Certainly Padre Martinez believes it. In 1843, he writes a letter to Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who's president of Mexico, one of the numerous times he was president. And Martinez basically says the native peoples bordering New Mexico trade bison robes to Americans for liquor. He says they become addicted to liquor. They hunt more bison to get more robes, to get more liquor. Eventually, this leads to overhunting. And in order to satisfy their thirst, they move from hunting to raiding New Mexican settlements for livestock that they then go and sell to American traders like the Bents. So again, a little bit exaggerated, but there's an element of truth to it. What is clear is that the Bents do purchase captive Mexicans, either from the states below New Mexico and also occasionally New Mexicans themselves. We have a lot of evidence that they purchase captives. William Bent especially purchases captives from the Kiowas and Comanches. And also Charles Bent, at least one of the domestic servants in his household was an Indian woman who was ransomed from what the records call the Northern Nations. So chances are she was either purchased from most likely the Utes, but possibly the Navajos as well. And the Bents do purchase stolen livestock. They purchase Mexican cattle, especially Mexican and New Mexican horses. In 1846, Martinez accuses Bent and the Cheyennes and employees of Bent's company of stealing a massive flock of Martinez sheep at one of their ranches in the Rio Arriba. Turns out it was Utes, but in the context, you can see how Martinez might have believed this was the case. Another element of this, and this really, as we sort of begin to zero in on Bent's situation in Taos itself, it's really important to understand about land grants. And in New Mexico, you know that land grants are still a pretty hotly contested issue. The Mexican government has a great deal of difficulty stimulating immigration to the borderlands. Nobody really from Mexico, from the central states, wants to go to Texas, wants to go to New Mexico. So what the government ends up doing is making very generous land grants to naturalized citizens, to immigrants from the United States. Texas is the classic example of this. And of course, this policy backfires in spectacular fashion in Texas and during the Revolution of 1835-36. Despite that, the government in New Mexico takes similar steps. And this is where Governor Jaramillo comes in and becomes a major player. Now, these two gentlemen on the screen, on the darker image, the gentleman with the very fancy sideburns and cravat, this is Saron San Vra. And then the grainier image on my right, this is Charles Beaubien. Both San Vra, the business partner, Beaubien, also a very close associate of Bent's. Now, in order to acquire a land grant in New Mexico, technically you need to go through a pretty rigorous process. Now, the grants, as you know, are really essential to the economic and social well-being of communities, particularly Pueblo communities. The grants generally tend to include multiple types of land. So you'll have woodlots, you'll have land for irrigation, you'll have land for hunting, and you'll usually have some land for grazing. So these grants are absolutely essential to the well-being of the Pueblos. Now, there's a very sort of rigorous technical process that you need to go through in order to acquire one of these grants. First of all, you have to be a citizen. Grants are not supposed to go to non-citizens. So usually what will happen is if you have a naturalized citizen, someone like Beaubien, they will oftentimes attach their petition to, they'll form a partnership with a prominent New Mexican. And this will hopefully better their chances of getting the land grant. So you want to sort of hook up with a well-connected local. Then you submit the grant, you lay out the parameters, this many acres, this is what we're going to do with it, here's our resume, we're good citizens, this is how we're going to develop the grant. And then the grant is reviewed, and that starts usually at the local level with the alcalde, the local political officer and judge in communities. The alcalde will sort of go through this, he'll check the references, and most importantly, they're supposed to check to see whether or not the grant conflicts with pre-existing grants, particularly again with Pueblo grants. And then the alcalde will basically make an initial judgment, yes or no, and then it goes to the governor. The governor eventually sort of signs off on it. So it's really significant for people like Bent to have local allies in positions of power. And as we're going to see, Beaubien in particular is going to run for the position of alcalde in Taos in 1846. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If there's a conflict of interest anywhere, whether it's the alcalde or the governor, they're supposed to recuse themselves. So the alcalde is not technically supposed to be part of any of this. And the governor, certainly if the governor has an interest in any of these grants, he's supposed to recuse himself. As we're going to see, particularly in Jaramillo's case, this rarely happens. So the grants that Bent becomes part of are problematic on many different levels. And I'll give you three examples, the three most famous. The first is in 1841, and this is a great map from, I believe it's a Leroy Hafen article in Colorado Magazine, I think from 1927. The first is the Beaubien Miranda Grant, better known as the Maxwell Grant. This is the one you can see with the blue star right here on the northern New Mexico, southern Colorado border. Now, in this case, we have Charles Beaubien and Guadalupe Miranda, who was a very prominent government official in northern New Mexico. Now, they petition Jaramillo for this grant, and this grant is for 2 million acres. So this is a huge chunk of real estate. Now, that's problematic because there's an 1824 Mexican land law that says for a two-person partnership, the most you can acquire is 96,000 acres. 96,000, 2 million. Well, so that's problematic. Also problematic is there are silent partners in this grant. Miranda and Beaubien are the public face of it. Charles Bent is has a 1/4 interest in this grant, which he should not legally have. And oh, by the way, the individual holding the other quarter interest in the grant is Governor Jaramillo, who signs off on the grant. Now, Martinez finds out about this. He's furious. He takes the case all the way to Durango in Mexico, tries to get the grant undone. It's temporarily revoked in 1844 by Governor Mariano Martinez, who replaced Jaramillo. But eventually, the New Mexico Assembly overrules Martinez, and Beaubien, Miranda, Jaramillo, and Bent eventually do take possession of the grant. People know about this. Martinez certainly knows about it. It is really, really, really sketchy. But Bent has acquired really interest in 500,000 acres. The next grant is a little bit further north in Colorado, the San Bras and V-Hill grant. So Saron San Bras is one of the parties, and the V-Hill in this case is Cornelio V-Hill, who is he'd been alcalde in Taos, and he's also Maria Ignacia's uncle. Bent is again a silent partner in this. Donaciano V-Hill is a silent partner in this. And there's another silent partner who, by the way, Governor Jaramillo again. And this grant is for 4 million acres. So Bent is now in the land business in Colorado. The third grant is the Sangre de Cristo grant, also known as the Beaubien Lee grant. This is Narciso Beaubien, Charles's son, and Stephen Lewis Lee of Taos. Here, this is for about 1 million acres. Bent is a 1/6 partner in this one. So we've got conflict of interest all over the place. And also one more I'll point out up here in Colorado, the Nolan grant, Gervais Nolan, who is a French-Canadian trapper in New Mexico who became a citizen, he gets access to about 1 million acres, and it's Cornelio V-Hill who approves Nolan's grant as well. So we see all these different individuals sort of coming together and overlapping in this pretty shady business. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that many of these grants overlap or conflict with either pre-existing grants, particularly the Taos Pueblo, or land that the Pueblo had become accustomed to using, and certainly that the Hickory Apaches were used to using. And Martinez raises this point very specifically in his correspondence. He says, the Indians have been using this land for decades. And that these grants are interfering with their subsistence, and it's also really, really shady and illegal. And the partners on these grants, they lie through their teeth on this. They go on the record and they say Charles Bent has nothing to do with this. This is just us. And why are you getting so worked up about this? Everything's on the level. Beaubien and Miranda say 2 million acres. It's not actually 2 million acres. It's 100,000 acres. So we've gone, 4,000 acres over, but, nothing to worry about. Now, when we look at the list of individuals who are killed in the Taos Revolt, we're going to see some very interesting crossover with the land grants. Charles Bent is killed. Cornelio Vigil is killed. Stephen Lee, who was the sheriff in Taos, he's killed. Narciso Beaubien is killed. And Charles Beaubien would have been killed, but he was out of town at the time. So there's a real overlap between these networks that are, in many cases, facilitated by these family connections that put Bent in a really strong economic position, but are really sort of raising the tension up and up and up and up and up in Taos. Now, I want to circle back about one more source of tension, and that is local politics. As I mentioned, having political allies can really, really help with the land business. And in 1846, the year that the U.S. Mexico War breaks out, the year that all of this is sort of, all these pressures are coming to a head, there's a very controversial election, alcalde election in Taos. Charles Beaubien is running against Santiago Martinez, who was one of Padre Martinez's brothers. And it's, by all accounts, a very close election. And Santiago wins by a pretty narrow margin, and Bent cries foul. He says that this was all rigged. He says that Martinez, the term he uses is that the priest was manipulating everything, and he's turning the officials into the term that Bent uses is cat's paws. So now, Martinez, the priest, is going to be pulling the strings of the election. Shortly after George Bent, Charles's younger brother, and Bent's buddy, Frank Blair, are attacked by a crowd in Taos. Bent admits that the young men were, the term he uses is, quote, in liquor, so they were drunk. But Bent claims that basically the servants of the Martinez family, and he refers to them as, quote, servants of the big family in his correspondence with Alvarez. He basically says that the Martinez family sicked their servants on Bent and Blair, that this was premeditated, and the authorities, particularly Santiago Martinez, did nothing to stop this. This was totally unprovoked, and maybe they're a little drunk, maybe they're a little rowdy, but it was totally unprovoked. Later testimony would indicate that the Bent and Blair, yes, they were extraordinarily drunk, but they were also very abusive, verbally, physically, and that the attack really wasn't unprovoked. And the Bent and Blair are arrested temporarily. There's an investigation, and then these rumors start circulating that Americans are stockpiling guns, that the Bents are going to raise the Utes to attack Taos. So the tensions are really high. Eventually, the investigation doesn't bring any charges. Bent and Blair are set free, but the situation is really bad. Well, one more example: all the wild rumors floating around. Apparently, Padre Martinez, told a story in Taos that Charles Bent and his associates were digging a tunnel underneath the Taos Parish Church, and they'd planted a whole load of gunpowder under the high altar in the church, and that when Martinez was celebrating Easter Mass, they were planning on blowing the church sky high. Again, no evidence to support this, but this sort of gives you a sense of how bad things are in Taos. Now, this all comes to a head in 1846-47. In August of 1846, Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West marches into Santa Fe. You know the story, marches in without firing a shot. New Mexico sort of surrenders very quickly. Jaramillo hightails it out of the country. Kearny is in charge of setting up a new government for New Mexico. Now, Manuel Alvarez, who knew the situation very well, he said, you got to consult the locals. You got to get prominent people who are unattached to the Americans if you want the government to be seen as legit. The Secretary of War tells Kearny this, and even President Polk. Polk wants to send priests with the U.S. Army, Catholic priests, as a demonstration of goodwill. Kearny ignores all of this. He makes Charles Bent governor of New Mexico. Bent is by now one of the most wildly unpopular men in all of New Mexico, but he becomes governor. Frank Blair becomes district attorney. Charles Beaubien becomes an associate justice of the Superior Court. The only prominent Nuevo Mexicano who's part of the government is Donaciano Vigil. And even for a lot of people, Vigil's loyalties to Mexico are suspect. He's viewed by some as an ally of the Americans. So the government that's set up is viewed by many people as illegitimate. In December of 1846, there's an aborted rebellion. It was set to take place on Christmas Day, but it was quashed. And when we move into the new year in January of 1847, the tension is really high, but Bent feels that the situation has blown over, and he feels that it's finally safe to go home to his home in Taos. He arrives in Taos on January 18, 1847, and goes home. And then on January 19, this is when all hell breaks loose in Taos. The revolt begins at the town jail. There were a couple of local men who were in prison for, they've been charged with theft, and there's a crowd that gathers outside the jail and demands their release. Stephen Lee, who's the sheriff, also a Bent land partner, Lee basically refuses to release the prisoners. Cornelio Vigil, Maria Ignacia's uncle, Bent's land partner, shows up. Vigil dresses down the crowd, calls them rascals, cowards, whatnot. The crowd attacks. They kill Vigil, they kill Lee, and they spread out through Taos. They find Narciso Beaubien. They find him in a haystack, drag him out of the haystack, kill him. They kill an American named James Leal, who was an attorney, and they eventually make their way to Bent's home. Bent comes out on the porch. He tries to negotiate with them, tell them to go home, and then they open fire on him, and they wound him on the steps of his home. As all of this is going on, the women inside the home are frantically digging through the adobe walls from one room into another, trying to escape. They're using kitchen implements. And there are a whole bunch of different conflicting stories about how Bent actually dies. There are stories that he sits down at a desk to try to write a letter, and he's shot and killed at his desk. Another story says that he's shot in the head with arrows, and then he tries to crawl through the tunnel and the arrows break off. There's stories that a family tried to get him to flee and he refused. At any rate, he doesn't make it very far. He's shot, he's killed, he's scalped. And the women of the family are in pretty dire straits, but they're spared. By all indications, their kinship ties, the fact that they were women and not viewed as threats to the community, probably saved their lives. And after Bent's killing, the women of the family spend the next few days basically hiding out in the homes of some of their local friends. Now, in a lot of the early American authored literature, for example, the memoirs of Dick Wooten, who was a very famous Colorado frontiersman, the Taos Revolt is portrayed as a race war. This is quote unquote savage Indians, savage Mexicans killing any white American that they can find. It's a lot more complicated than that. Again, race, ethnicity have nothing to do with this. This is all, I think, based on proximity to Bent's activities. So again, you look at the list of the dead: Stephen Lee, ties with Bent; Cornelio Vigil, ties with Bent; Narciso Beaubien, ties with Bent; Pablo Jaramillo, Maria Ignacia's brother, he's killed. The home of a man named Jose Rafael Sena de Luna, who was Maria Ignacia's first husband's father, or father-in-law. His home is destroyed. He has connections to this Jaramillo Bent family group. So the crowd knows They know who they're after, and they're after the people who are a threat to the community. Why are they a threat to the community? Because they've acquired all of this power. How they acquired all of this power? Through these family and social networks. This image here of the ruined Taos Pueblo Church in a little bit later in January, early February, a U.S. Army marches north from Santa Fe under Sterling Price. There's a battle in Taos. The U.S. artillery blows holes in the doors of the parish church. There's a running fight on the plains. Those who had taken shelter in the church are trying to get to the mountains. By the time it's over, Price estimated that about 150 of what he labeled the insurgents had been killed at the cost of about a dozen or so American casualties. There's a series of trials, treason trials, that take place in New Mexico after this. And it's also worth pointing out, there's not just violence in Taos. There's attacks on Mora, for example. American Army herds are attacked. So this is a very long, very violent process in northern New Mexico. But there's a series of trials, and a number of men are charged with treason, and they're hanged. The trials in Taos are particularly notable. There's nothing really, there's no due process here. The presiding judge, Charles Beaubien, was father of one of those killed. The Maria Ignacia gives eyewitness testimony. George Bent sits in the jury. A number of the other jurymen were employees of Bent San Vrain Company. So this is hardly a fair trial by any stretch. One of the big questions about all of this is the role that Padre Martinez played or didn't play. In the original Anglo-American retellings of the events in the late 19th, early 20th century, Martinez is painted as the sort of mastermind behind the rebellion, that he hatched a conspiracy, he set things in motion. This is what Kit Carson believed. And Carson talked a lot with historians and writers, and he's Kit Carson, so his word is gospel truth. And if Kit Carson says Martinez was involved, Martinez must have been involved. There's no evidence of this. I personally find it hard to believe that he was unaware of trouble brewing. He had to know the situation was tense, but there's absolutely no contemporary evidence that he was complicit in the violence. The best contemporary evidence that we have that he is taken by surprise is that he actually takes Stephen Lee's brother into his home and offers him protection. And that he keeps and his servants keep the crowd away, that they protect the life of the brother of one of the first victims. There's also a very long oral tradition in northern New Mexico that basically argues that Martinez was really taken by surprise, and that he, rather than incite the crowd, actually tried to calm them down and lower the tension. So his role, very controversial in the long Anglo-American memory. Martinez is a villain. Certainly, he's a villain in the Willa Cather novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop. In Nuevo Mexicano memory, on the other hand, Martinez is viewed far more favorably. He's almost canonized by some writers. He's a very complicated figure. Now, after all of this is said and done, what happens, to the partnership? Bent San Vrain Company falls apart very quickly after Charles Bent's death. He seems to have been sort of the glue that held the partnership together, the personality that was the driving force behind it. After his death, San Vrain and William Bent partner for a short time, but eventually that falls apart. They don't seem to have meshed particularly well. And so by the end of 1847, this company that had been this really powerful force on the southern plains in New Mexico dissolves. over the course of the next couple of years, things get even worse. The war with Mexico had dramatically increased traffic along the Santa Fe Trail. And then gold is discovered in California in 1849. The Arkansas River route is pretty popular with some 49ers. And as the traffic over the trail intensifies, you get more and more and more Americans coming and going from New Mexico to Missouri. And this leads to intense competition with native peoples, particularly the Kiowas and Comanches, over access to bison herds, over access to water, over access to campsites, over access to wood and to firewood in particular. And the situation begins to deteriorate very quickly. And there's an increase, a huge spike in Indian raids along the Santa Fe Trail in 1847, 1848. And you can see a romanticized image of this. I think this is a Charles Russell painting. And then sort of and this instability makes it very difficult for Bent to do business. War and instability are not good for business. And then the death blow comes in 1849. There's a massive cholera epidemic that strikes the Southern Plains. It really, by all accounts, it kills probably 50% of the Southern Cheyenne, decimates some Comanche and Kiowa bands. And this is sort of the end of the line for Bent in 1849 after the epidemic, in which he loses his mother-in-law, Cheyenne woman. Bent abandons his fort on the Arkansas, sets fire to it, and moves his operations down. They stop there, and then, from 1849 to 1869, he does a lot of really interesting stuff outside the scope of this talk. In New Mexico, Charles Bent's family, they have a really fascinating story too, again, beyond the scope of this. But Bent's children are educated. The girls in particular go to the Loretto, Sisters of Loretto school in Santa Fe. They're among one of the first to matriculate there. The family remains involved in the land grant business in Colorado mostly, but also in New Mexico. And interestingly enough, Bent's daughter, Teresina, becomes sort of an unofficial family historian. You may be aware that George Bent, William Bent's son, plays this role. He becomes sort of the preeminent oral historian for the Southern Cheyenne. Teresina Bent Shurik sort of does the same thing for her family. But interestingly enough, where George Bent portrays American expansion as this great disaster for his mother's people, Teresina Bent Shurik has a much more positive view of American expansion. She views American expansion as a good thing. She views her father, Charles, as sort of this selfless hero and eventually martyr for manifest destiny. But those are a whole different story. So I could go on and on and on and on about that. But I am going to end here in 1849. And I am open to fielding any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dave, for speaking to us today about the Bent family. That was great. I do have a couple questions. First off, it seems like such a big subject. How did you get interested in a century of the Bent family? Seems like a lot of people and a lot of time. What got you to this?
Well, I got really lucky because when I started my PhD program, I wanted to do something on the fur trade originally. There were some other books I read and concepts I was kicking around. And then I reread David Lavender's 1954 Bent's Fort. He was a great stylist, but his interpretation on a lot of things was really pretty awful. His view of native peoples, his view of New Mexicans was very problematic. And he really didn't have any sort of interpretive framework. So I was looking for something and I just got lucky. The family combined the fur trade, the Santa Fe trade, the U.S. Mexico War, the Plains Indian Wars. They really, even before I started really digging into them, they sort of hit all of these different all of these different points for me. The book project itself just kept getting larger and larger and larger and larger. My dissertation stopped in 1849. It was a story of the company. But then I realized, I got some feedback, and I realized I had to expand it a little bit more. What happens afterwards? So I thought I was going to do this, and then I'm going to add like 10 pages to an epilogue and say, oh yeah, all this other stuff happened, like there was Sand Creek and all this, but whatever, that's not the point. But when I started to go back and look at the significance of family and family relations were the sort of the driving force, I realized I couldn't stop in 1849. I had to take it at least 1869, which was when William Bent died. And the working title of the book was The Bents, The Rise and Fall of a Borderlands Family, because that's what I was expecting to find. Things are really going well. The Americans come, everything goes to hell. William Bent dies, the end. But then one of the people who reviewed the book manuscript is like, well, what happens after 1869? What happens to all these people who you mentioned? And I went back and forth with my editor. I said, I really don't want to do this. I'm not going to find anything. She said, just spend about a month on it. And I just kept finding stuff and finding stuff and finding stuff. And the more I looked and the longer the story went, the interpretation changed. This is not a rise and fall story. This is a story. It's a very complicated story of people in very complicated times, just trying to survive, and to use the tools that they have: violence, education, land, whatever it is, in order to just sort of make the best of their situation, and they have a really tough situation. The book ends in 1920 because that's when George Bent died, and I had to to stop somewhere.
To stop somewhere.
But it was really, and we were talking before we came on. You asked me how long the project took. It took 8 years. From the end, from the dissertation from when I graduated until 2020 when it was published, and that was largely a product of just I got to keep finding and keep going, and I kept finding more and more stuff. So I think they're the my unbiased opinion is that they're the most fascinating family in the history of the American West, and I just kept going and going and going.
That's great. You've talked about family quite a couple times here, and obviously we focused on Charles today, and a little bit on William. Are there any other family members, maybe even a woman? I was going to say wife. I'm not sure. We seem to not all have wives in this, but or a daughter or somebody that you could share a short story about.
Sure. There are a couple of Bent sisters. It's a very large family in Missouri, and one of them, her name escapes me at the moment. One of them was married to a man named Lilburn Boggs, who eventually became governor of Missouri. She died. Boggs remarried, but the Boggs family and the Bent family remained very close, particularly in Colorado. Another one of the sisters, named Dorcas, she married into a very prominent St. Louis family, a very prominent political family, one of the most powerful attorneys in the city of St. Louis. And then there are a whole host of other ones, particularly daughters, the next generation. One of William Bent's daughters plays a very prominent role in the settlement on the Arkansas River in Colorado. Some of the sisters are educated in Missouri. They maintain their access to the land grants in Colorado. And I think one of the really fascinating stories in the 1870s, 1880s, is that their husbands build small empires in Colorado, particularly ranching, on the basis of their wives' access to land. And in the land records, the women, the daughters, are not petitioning the land office directly. Their husbands are writing to the surveyors in Pueblo and Trinidad, and basically saying, we are petitioning for this land on behalf of our wives who have this very long history. Their title to this land goes back 30 years, and we find this also. The Bent children, Williams children, also were granted land by the U.S. government as a byproduct of the Treaty of the Little Arkansas in 1865, really as sort of repayment, you might say, for Sand Creek. And so there's a lot of land available, and a lot of it goes to the women. And also, as I say, Teresina Bent in Taos, she becomes a very prominent player in the Taos community. And again, she corresponds with historians and writers, very few of whom are remembered today. Probably the most famous at the time was a man named Edward Sabin, who wrote a 2-volume biography of Kit Carson. But she also, she must have corresponded with newspaper editors too, because her recollections of her father's death and the Taos Rebellion showed up in newspapers as far away as San Francisco. I think she was published in the San Francisco Chronicle. Unfortunately, her correspondence seems to have disappeared. And so I had to sort of piece this together from a number of other sources. I found an author's name. I was like, oh my God, I have to find these letters. Where are they? Frantic, searching. They're not there. So there's a lot more that's there, but you just have to keep digging.
Right. You were talking. You mentioned General Kearny picks Charles Bent and his gang to be the new government, and yet you also said in the same sentence or the same paragraph that he was one of the most unpopular guys in northern New Mexico at the time. Do we know why General Kearny picked him?
As unpopular as he is, you're not going to find too many people who do really know the area well. Who do have, Bent is a wildly successful businessman. He has these connections in Missouri. He has connections as far east as New York City. He knows the area. He knows the players. He's bilingual. He writes and speaks Spanish. So despite his unpopularity, for better or worse, he's a known commodity. And under maybe slightly different circumstances, he might have been a really, a smart pick. But when he becomes governor, he actually spends a fair amount of his correspondence writing to Kearny, writing to Doniphan, even writing to Thomas Hart Benton, the very powerful Missouri senator, basically scolding American troops for stealing sheep from citizens, for making nuisances of themselves. He writes to Benton and he says, we need money out here. We need money for schools. We need money for, printing presses. So he does, he does try to make himself an effective governor. And again, probably short of Donaciano Vigil, I don't actually know that there probably are really any other options, because of a lot of the wealthy families, particularly in Albuquerque, would have had no interest in it. best I can tell. So turns out to be a very flawed pick, but I think given the time and place, a very logical choice.
Okay. When we were talking before the lecture, you mentioned that the views of present day people in Colorado are very different than present day people of New Mexico about Charles Bent. Why? What was up with that?
I think because the businesses are different, people are different, players are different. William Bent seems to have been I'm not gonna say he was a pleasant guy. He had his moments as well, but he is much more diplomatic. He plays much better with others, you might say. And part of it too is that the Bents really don't do anything terribly controversial in Colorado. If anything, they find themselves more often the victim than the victimizer, because you get Sand Creek, George and Charlie and one of their sisters and a mother-in-law. And they're also they're associated with the fur trade, which in the early mid 20th century, very hot topic. It was a legitimate historical topic. And then when the Park Service rebuilt the fort in La Junta, it's a brilliant reconstruction. And then also there's a restaurant outside of Denver, the Fort restaurant up by Red Rocks, which was actually the model that the Park Service used to rebuild the fort. In New Mexico, Charles Bent is a lot more controversial. I mean, he causes a lot more damage. You read his correspondence, and he is a really, really unpleasant guy. He really does not like his neighbors. He is constantly complaining about how put upon he is. Everybody's against me. Everybody hates me. Everybody accuses me of doing all this stuff. I am doing a lot of this stuff, but everybody's accusing me of doing all this awful stuff. I didn't really, when I started the research, I didn't really have a sense of this. But on my first research trip to Santa Fe, I think it was about 2010, I came to the State Records Collection and Archives to look at the Benjamin Reed collection, which has all of Charles's correspondence with Manuel Alvarez. And I came into the archive, and one of the archivists, a Hispanic fellow, he asked me what I was there to do, what I was there to research. And I said, I'm here to research Charles Bent. And he got this big grin on his face. He said, yeah, Charles Bent, we really didn't like him here, so we scalped him. And
great.
And I was like, what? I mean, this is before I knew much about him. Like, you're talking about my hero. Here's this great guy, and you're talking about how hated he was. At the time, I was just kind of, what's up with this? And then I started reading the letters. And I was like, I guess I can see this. But in Taos especially, if you just sort of look at who is commemorated and how they're commemorated, Martinez is much more fondly remembered in Taos. The Taos Museum Consortium has, rebuilt and preserved, the Martinez Hacienda, which is a really great museum. Bent has a street. He has a restaurant, which is decent. It's okay. And there's a Governor Charles Bent museum, which it's, shall we say, it's not as good as the Martinez Museum. It's not as good as the fort up in New Mexico or up in Colorado. But I just think a lot of it has to do with what they did, what the results of their actions were, and just sort of how they comported themselves. And Charles Bent was just a much more prickly guy, and the family as a whole was responsible for a lot of a lot of disruption, but for better or worse, in New Mexico, he is the public face of this. So I think it's understandable. I have a much more, I hope, nuanced view of him now than I did. I went from hero to villain, sort of 0 to 60 very quickly. But I mean, in the context of his time, he's not a whole lot different than a lot of other Americans. He's a lot more successful, at least for a while.
Right. Okay, so this lecture is being pre-recorded, and so our audience is not able to ask you questions. Is it okay if people reach out to you, send you an email, and ask any questions?
Absolutely. Be happy
Great.
to answer anything I can.
That would be great. Then your book, the reviews of your book that I was reading online are very favorable. They talk about how well researched and nuanced and well written and readable it is. Where can people buy your book? I think you released it in 2020, which was probably not the best time to be releasing new books and trying to go on a book tour. But where can we get it now?
Well, I would start with the University of Nebraska Press website, and if you can get on their mailing list, they usually have pretty decent sales, 40-50% off. It's in paperback now, so buy the paperback edition. It's much more reasonably priced. But the press website is a great place. It's also on Amazon. One of my buddies from Dallas, it's available on bookstores in Santa Fe too. One of my buddies from Dallas sent me a picture just last week. I'm not sure which bookstore he was in, but he's like, "Hey, you might recognize this," and sent me a picture. So it may be available at a local independent bookstore, but certainly the University of Nebraska Press website is probably the best place to get it.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you again, Dave. This was excellent. I appreciate your sharing the story of the Bent family with us and taking the time to be part of the Friends of History lecture series.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks. For our audience, in closing, just a reminder to visit our webpage at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch this lecture and any of the other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures. Click on the lecture series link at the top of that page and past lectures, and there are many there. If you wish to learn more about upcoming lectures or more broadly about the Friends of History, we encourage you to join our mailing list or email us at nmhm@friendsofhistory@gmail.com. And finally, we do request that you consider making a donation to Friends of History, no matter the size, through our website so that the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. And thank you to all of you who have been contributing to the Friends of History over the last several years. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye.